Hey everyone, today we're diving into the interesting world of ancient Egyptian warfare, starting with one of the most iconic pieces of history, the Narmer palette. Now, this isn't just any old artifact, it's a ceremonial engraving that shows the great king Narmer, around 3150 BCE, in full action, conquering his enemies with the backing of the gods. Pretty epic, right? Originally, people thought the Narmer palette was a literal depiction of Narmer uniting Egypt by force, becoming the first king of a unified Egypt. But here's the twist. Modern scholars believe this scene is more symbolic. It might not show exactly how Narmer unified Egypt, but it does reflect how important it was in their culture to see the king as a strong, warrior-like figure. Whether Narmer actually fought to bring Egypt together or not, the image of him as a conqueror stuck, and that's what mattered. Now, unlike the kings of Mesopotamia, who loved to brag about their military victories, the Egyptians didn't really care much for conquest, at least not early on. They saw Egypt as the best place on earth and were more focused on keeping what they had. Early Egyptian warfare was more about dealing with internal issues like civil unrest rather than going out to conquer other lands. This approach stayed pretty consistent from the early dynastic period all the way through to the Middle Kingdom, when things started to shift a bit. Even though there's debate about whether Narmer unified Egypt by force, there's no doubt that having a strong military was essential to keeping the country together. The early dynastic period was filled with unrest, possibly even civil wars over who got to sit on the throne. During the Old Kingdom, the central government didn't have a permanent army. Instead, they relied on local governors, called nomarchs, to gather soldiers from their regions. Each unit of soldiers represented their district, known as a nome, and their loyalty was first to their community and then to their nomarch. These early militias were surprisingly effective, leading successful campaigns into places like Nubia, Syria, and Palestine, to either secure Egypt's borders or bring in resources. But here's the thing, they weren't a united national army. Instead, they were more like small groups of soldiers fighting for the same cause. And, if necessary, they'd hire Nubian mercenaries who were loyal so long as the money kept coming. As the power of these nomarchs grew, it actually contributed to the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Each nomarch started acting like their own king, even building temples in their honor and using their soldiers for their personal gain. Eventually, the central government in Memphis lost control, and Egypt entered a chaotic time known as the First Intermediate Period. It wasn't until a king from Thebes, Mentuhotep II, rose to power that things started to change. He likely led an army of conscripts, but may have also begun creating a professional fighting force. However, it's his successor, Amenemhat, who is credited with forming Egypt's first standing army. This was a game changer because it shifted power away from the individual nomarchs and placed it directly in the hands of the king, giving him control over an army loyal to Egypt as a whole. As for the weapons they used, well, during the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, soldiers primarily fought with maces, daggers, and spears. By the Old Kingdom, they had added bows and arrows to their arsenal. The historian Margaret Bunsen gives a great description of these soldiers, noting how they wore skull caps and carried totems of their district into battle. Their weapons were basic, like stone-headed maces and flint-tipped arrows. Many soldiers fought barefoot, wearing simple kilts or even nothing at all. Their bows were pretty simple too, just a single arched design that was tough to draw, had a short range, and wasn't the most accurate. These soldiers weren't trained archers. Most of them were lower-class peasants with little to no experience hunting, since hunting was a privilege reserved for the wealthy. But when it came to battle, firing volleys of arrows in close quarters, even these basic weapons could be deadly. After a couple of rounds of arrows, the soldiers would rush in with their handheld weapons to finish the job. And while Egypt had a navy, it was mostly used to transport troops, not for naval warfare at this point. So by the time of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt's military had definitely leveled up. Soldiers were no longer just a ragtag bunch of conscripts. They were equipped with copper axes, swords, and bronze-tipped spears. They even had leather body armor to go along with their short kilts. The whole army became much more organized, with ranks and a chain of command. There was even a dedicated minister of war and a commander-in-chief who managed the military structure. And here's something new. They had elite shock troops who were highly trained and led the charge in battles. The army was now a real career path for men looking to rise in rank and make a name for themselves. While we don't have a ton of records about the military structure in the Middle Kingdom, it's clear that its role in society was far greater than before. The army became an outlet for ambitious men, many of whom were stationed abroad for long periods. Most of the troops were still recruited from local populations and only participated in specific campaigns, but now there was a core of professional soldiers who were ready for action at any time. One of the most famous warrior kings from this period was Senusret III, who ruled from around 1878 to 1860 BCE. He was known for leading major campaigns in Nubia and Palestine, abolishing the position of nomarch and taking direct control of the regions where his soldiers came from. By doing this, he not only secured Egypt's borders but also ensured that the military was fully under the king's control. But then came the Hyksos. These were a Semitic people from Syria-Palestine who settled in Lower Egypt. Over time, they became powerful enough to challenge the Egyptian central government, marking the beginning of what's known as the Second Intermediate Period. During this period, Egypt was split, the Hyksos in the north, the Egyptians in the middle, and the Nubians to the south. There was a lot of tension, but for the most part, the three groups kept an uneasy peace, trading with each other. Things really kicked off when Seqenenre, the Egyptian king at Thebes, felt threatened by the Hyksos king Epepi and decided to attack. This led to a series of conflicts, and ultimately, the Hyksos were driven out of Egypt by Ahmose I, which marked the beginning of the New Kingdom. Now, here's where things get interesting. While the Hyksos were seen by some later Egyptian writers as a destructive foreign force, they actually introduced Egypt to a whole bunch of new military innovations. They brought in the horse-drawn war chariot, a composite bow made of wood, sinew, and horn, and a scimitar-like sword called the khopesh. The Egyptians took these tools and made them their own, turning them into weapons that would dominate the battlefield for centuries to come. When the New Kingdom began, the Egyptians were determined to make sure they'd never be invaded again. Their solution? Expansion. They pushed their borders out, creating buffer zones to protect the heart of Egypt, and launched military campaigns to build an empire. This brings us to the era of some of the most famous names in Egyptian history, like Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Seti I, and of course, Ramses II. The New Kingdom was Egypt at its peak, and it was largely thanks to its new imperialist military strategy. Conquest became a regular part of the pharaoh's duties, and Egypt was almost constantly at war during this period. Thutmose III, who ruled from 1458 to 1425 BCE, is considered the greatest military leader of the early New Kingdom. He expanded Egypt's empire, leading campaigns in Libya, Nubia, and throughout the Levant. He led at least 17 campaigns in just 20 years and built Egypt into an empire at its height. To do this, he needed a professional army, and this was when Egypt's military really became a force to be reckoned with. The army was now organized into divisions of around 5,000 men, each named after one of Egypt's principal gods. These divisions had a strict hierarchy, with officers commanding units of 50 soldiers, who in turn reported to officers in charge of 250 men, and so on up the chain of command. One of the biggest game changers in the New Kingdom army was the chariot, introduced by the Hyksos. Egyptian charioteers were well trained and often came from wealthy families because they had to provide their own equipment. These charioteers were elite troops, highly respected, and they played a key role in Egypt's military dominance. The Egyptians even improved upon the original design of the Hyksos chariots, making them lighter, faster, and more maneuverable. The chariot forces were divided into squadrons, with a commander leading 12 chariots and 24 men. Each chariot held 2 soldiers, a driver and a warrior who was armed with a bow, arrows, and a spear. These elite chariot units became a cornerstone of the Egyptian military and helped establish their empire. And that empire flourished under pharaohs like Amenhotep III, who ruled during a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity. The army was able to keep Egypt's enemies at bay, far from the borders, ensuring that the heart of the empire remained secure. And during the Old Kingdom, the Navy's role was pretty straightforward. They were mainly there to transport troops up and down the Nile. Even as late as the Second Intermediate Period, the Navy was just ferrying soldiers to their destinations, like when Kamos used it to transport his men to attack Avaris. But as we move into the New Kingdom, things start to shift. The Navy began to take on a more prestigious role, especially as Egypt's wealth and prosperity were increasingly threatened by invaders coming from the sea. And let's talk about these invaders, the Sea Peoples, one of the most mysterious groups from ancient history. To this day, no one knows exactly who they were. They're believed to have been a coalition of different groups, possibly from around the Mediterranean, and they became a major problem around 1276 to 1178 BCE. Some historians even think they might have had a hand in the Bronze Age collapse, which shook multiple civilizations. Now, Egypt had its hands full with the Sea Peoples, but some of its most famous pharaohs were able to hold their ground. Ramses II, for example, was prepared for them. Thanks to a sharp intelligence network, he got wind of the invasion before it happened. He quickly positioned his navy at the Nile's mouth to block the attackers and even set up a defensive fleet. But the real move was when he lured the Sea Peoples into a trap. Once their ships were in range, he released his bigger fleet and wiped them out. Pretty strategic, right? But here's the thing. Even though these were sea battles, the Egyptians weren't really fighting in the way we think of naval warfare today. They weren't skilled seamen. Their approach was more like a land battle on water. Their ships were huge, sometimes carrying up to 250 men, but they weren't fighting with the ships themselves. The real strategy was to get close enough to board enemy vessels, engage in hand-to-hand combat, and sink the other ships afterward. It was essentially a land battle fought on floating platforms. We see a similar strategy with Ramses III, who also had to deal with the Sea Peoples later on. He basically repeated Ramses II's tactics, trapping the invaders and picking them off using guerrilla warfare. Meremta, another pharaoh, didn't even bother fighting them at sea. He avoided the water entirely and just crushed them on land. Now, the real strength of the Egyptian navy wasn't just in its fighting abilities, but in its ability to intimidate potential invaders and to quickly transport land troops when needed. Thutmose III, for instance, made good use of the navy in his campaigns, and when necessary, cargo ships were converted into war vessels. They'd add bulwarks to protect the crew from arrows and spears and improve the ships for better maneuverability. But as with all things, Egypt's military power didn't last forever. After Ramses III's reign, things started to go downhill. Egypt's military might and successes became a thing of the past. And part of the problem was internal. See, Ramses II had moved Egypt's capital from Thebes to Per-Ramses. Thebes, of course, was home to the great temple of Amun, and the priests of Amun were already powerful. But with the pharaohs shifting their attention elsewhere, these priests were able to amass even more power. By the time Ramses XI came around, Egypt was practically split into two, the pharaoh's rule in Per-Ramses and the priests' rule in Thebes. This division marked the beginning of what historians call the Third Intermediate Period. At this point, Egypt's naval power was overshadowed by newer, stronger fleets from Greece and Phoenicia. These nations had faster ships, better technology, and experienced sailors. Egypt had entered what we now call the Iron Age by 1000 BCE, and while they started making iron tools and weapons, it didn't turn the tide in their favor. Producing iron was costly since Egypt had few natural resources, and they had to import much of what they needed. Egypt's decline was further highlighted by their defeats at the hands of outside powers. In 671 BCE, Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded with a professional army armed with superior iron weapons and armor. The Egyptian forces stood little chance, and Esarhaddon ended up sacking Memphis and dragging Egyptian royalty back to Nineveh. His son, Ashurbanipal, followed up with another invasion that pushed as far south as Thebes, further devastating Egypt. By this point, Egypt was well into what we call the late period. The once great Egyptian military was now fractured, and internal conflicts among the royal family only made things worse. They resorted to hiring Greek mercenaries to fight their battles, but these hired soldiers often didn't have any real loyalty and would fight for whoever paid them more. Eventually, many of these mercenaries just settled down in Egypt and gave up the fight altogether. Even though Egypt had iron weapons and a decent cavalry by this time, it just wasn't enough to restore its military strength. Iron was expensive, and Egypt simply didn't have the infrastructure to sustain its military dominance. The Persian Empire eventually invaded in 525 BCE, defeating Egypt's forces at Pelusium. But this victory wasn't just about superior military force. Cambyses II, the Persian general, used a clever psychological trick. He knew how much the Egyptians revered animals, especially cats. So, he marched into battle with animals at the front of his army, including cats, and threatened to throw them over the walls of the city if the Egyptians didn't surrender. Fearing the wrath of the gods for harming the sacred animals, the Egyptians gave in without much of a fight. After this, Egypt's military was never the same. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 331 BCE, and after his death, it fell under the rule of his general Ptolemy, starting the Ptolemaic dynasty. But by then, Egypt was no longer the powerhouse it had been during the New Kingdom. The military innovations and advances in weaponry that had once made Egypt so formidable were now relics of the past, with no strong central government to back them up. The era of ancient Egyptian warfare, as we know it, effectively ended.